What do you like to call friends you like to eat with? Taste buds? In the Gospels, Jesus trains his followers not only to trust the Father more, but also to humble themselves faster. When our family learns to set aside our egos and to do it faster, we experience a remarkable increase in our willingness to offer love generously to others. And perhaps surprisingly, the way Jesus trains his followers in humility actually results in them becoming more confident. Jesus would have us raise our children in the same way. Why humility? Humility is setting ourselves aside so that we trust the Father more than we trust ourselves. For instance, in Psalm 10, verse 8, it says, "In his pride, the arrogant does not seek God. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God." And likewise, on the positive side, Matthew 5:3, Jesus says, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his kingdom." So, in other words, less of my ego equals more capacity for responding to what the Father has prepared. We forget that our days are not our own and that it's not about us, that there's a reason the Father has given us his abundance. We have our own insecurities and excuses. We have our priorities and to-do lists. To put it bluntly, we are often full of ourselves. It was true for the original disciples, and it's true for us today. And there's not much the Father can do through us for the good of others when we are full of ourselves.
As you can imagine, Greg and I both have trouble with this, as do many people. Pride gets in the way. We both want to be right, and our kids often saw that too. They saw us full of ourselves. and and that's hard sometimes, but it also is a good learning experience for them to see that we have to humble ourselves and we have to work it out. And we could explain it to our kids as they saw us authentically going through differences of opinion and who's right, that it was just like them with their siblings, that they didn't always agree with everything that their sisters were saying or doing, but they loved them very much and they were working it out, and it was going to be for the good of everybody that happens. Humbling yourself is hard. Being full of yourself, it comes much too naturally.
So, how is humility actually developed? It's one thing to know that we need to humble ourselves faster so we get out of our own way, not only in how we deal with each other, but in how we respond to the opportunities God brings across our path. The tough reality is there's only one way to learn humility, and that is the hard way. We see that with Peter in the Gospels and how Jesus consistently would bring Peter through humbling experiences so that he could free Peter up from being full of Peter and thus not only be in a better position to relate to his fellow trainees, but also to be willing to respond to the opportunities the Father was going to be placing before him. We read in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7, the words of Peter. He writes there, "God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." See, that's Peter after Jesus had developed his capacity for humbling himself faster. This is not Peter in Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus said, "Come follow me." This is not Peter in Matthew chapter 8, where Jesus had to humble Peter. This is not Matthew chapter 14, where Jesus has to humble Peter. This is not Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus has to humble Peter. This is not Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus has to humble Peter. In other words, Jesus continually takes opportunity to humble Peter so that Peter learns how to humble himself. That's what he says here finally in 1 Peter chapter 5. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. He says, take it from me, I know. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. What Peter is able to tell those of us that are reading his writings centuries later, as well as those that Peter was able to interact with day by day in his time, is that when we trust the Father more and also learn how to humble ourselves faster, that we're going to be able to be utilized by the Father in joining his Son on his mission. So how did Jesus manage the tricky balance of humbling his followers so that they could actually become more confident? In other words, as they learn to humble themselves, set themselves aside so that they are able to trust the Father more and respond more generously. Well, in the Gospels, we see that Jesus basically does four things. One, Jesus practices humility himself. In other words, he is aware that what they see is what they'll be. And we need to do the same thing with our children. We need to let them see us practicing humility. Practice humility before God, going to God and asking for his help and asking for his guidance. Humbling ourselves before our spouse and how we deal with one another and how we humble ourselves and say we're sorry. And humbling ourselves even with our own children, that when we have done something wrong or said something wrong, that we humble ourselves and we, approach them with a sense of wanting to be forgiven. And so practicing humility ourselves is the first step. Number two, Jesus is clear about what he is doing as he trains his followers. In other words, he understands that being humbled and practicing humility is painful. And because it's painful, he's careful. And we need to be the same. We need to be aware with our children as well, that when we are teaching them to be humble, it's painful. And that because it's painful, we got to be careful not to do it out of anger, not to do it out of frustration, but to do it out of love, to do it because we know that little by little over time, gaining the ability to humble themselves will be a great gift. Number three, Jesus is clear about why he is doing it. He is understanding that though it is painful, it has a payoff, and that it's worth doing it because of that payoff. So even though we know it is painful, we are clear that we need to do it, because to not do it leaves them arrogant and full of themselves, and nobody's going to really want to be with them anyway. So this way, even though it's painful, we know it has a payoff, and we're clear about the why. And then number four, Jesus loves his trainees enough to keep at it. With Peter, it wasn't a one and done situation. It wasn't that Jesus taught him humility all in one moment and then they didn't have to go back to it. No, egos have a way of growing back. And so Jesus had to love them enough to stay at it, that day by day, week by week, month by month, that when opportunities arose, he didn't crush them, but he coached them about how to humble themselves so that they would be in a better position to be able to respond to the people and especially the opportunities God had placed around them.
Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 5. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his kingdom.